Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Sophia Meranto, an analyst with Eurasia Group. Sophia, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I want to talk about really significant developments in the Middle East over the past couple of days. Israeli strikes in Lebanon have killed multiple leaders of Hezbollah, including Hassan Nasrallah. So, can you describe the significance of the events over the past weekend?
What we have seen over the last 48, 72 hours in the region is really quite remarkable. First, the killing of several senior Hezbollah leaders. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah will, of course, be making a lot of the headlines, but really the Israeli campaign in Lebanon has been very effective and has really successfully targeted several of the senior leadership. And this is going to have an impact, one, on how Israel continues to approach its offensive in Lebanon. It's going to have an impact on Hezbollah as an organization, right? And potentially have a wider impact on Israeli willingness to tolerate or to take risks in different fronts across the region. So it's really a very significant development, what we've witnessed over the weekend in Lebanon.
So let's take it from the top. You mentioned the one leader who has been making quite a few headlines, Nasrallah, Hezbollah's Secretary General. Who was he? Can you talk us through who he was a little bit?
Sure. I think it's really important to understand Hassan Nasrallah, what kind of a leader he was, the role that he really commanded within Hezbollah, but more widely, I would say, actually within the axis of resistance grouping of these different groups that are aligned across the region with Iran. He was extremely influential in Hezbollah, but also in Lebanon, a figure that was very revered among Hezbollah supporters. And I think that this has really come as a shock that he has been able to be targeted in this manner and really is going to force Hezbollah, but also more widely the constituents that support Hezbollah to relook at the organization and how it's organized. So no, an incredibly important figure in the axis of resistance. He had a lot of credibility internally among these groups, partly due to his long-standing leadership of Hezbollah, right? But also role in different kinds of operations and really going back, I would say, to 2006 and the previous Hezbollah Israel war, and that gave him a lot of credibility, and he's really managed to carry the organization over what would now have been almost 2 decades.
Aside from Nasrallah, multiple members of Hezbollah's top leadership were killed over the past couple of days. And just less than 2 weeks ago, we remember the pager incident across Lebanon where thousands of members of Hezbollah were wounded. So what does the future of Hezbollah look like?
That is the key question, right? Will Hezbollah be able to regroup, reorganize itself over the longer term? I think so, but there are definitely some serious leadership, operational, I would say, and logistical challenges from what you described, going back right to the pager device attacks over the past week or two. But really, I would go back further to October 2023 and a sustained Israeli campaign that has been taking place since then, mainly focused on southern Lebanon. So it's been more of an outlier now, the attacks in Beirut, but are less of a rare occurrence. But there has been this sustained campaign really over almost a year now to try to degrade Hezbollah capabilities, to kill Hezbollah commanders, right? And that has been relatively effective.
So, if that has been relatively effective as of now, what is Israel's ultimate goal when it comes to Lebanon, when it comes to Hezbollah, and how close are they to achieving it?
Sure. So Israel's stated goal is really to return these displaced residents from these northern communities near the border with Lebanon. It has become an official goal of the government now. It was adopted over the past 2 weeks, and really has, I think, pushed the Israeli political and military leadership to take much more aggressive action in Lebanon, which we're seeing now. So that is the goal that underpins what we're seeing. But really, again, there's a history that goes back several decades, and especially this bottom-up pressure in Israel that previously this threat from Hezbollah has not, according to Israeli perceptions, been adequately addressed, right? And now that needs to take place. So it's important, I think, to understand that it is not just a decision that's taken in government or by the military leaders, but it's really driven by quite intensive grassroots, bottom-up pressure within Israeli society to, quote, change this status quo. And now, again, back to what we were talking about, I mean, the fact that this military campaign has been as effective as it has been over this short space of time may mean that the government considers, broader goals, and maybe some of those goalposts change in terms of what it is seeking to achieve in Lebanon. And let me also add that fundamental to that, right, to being able to return the residents to the north is not just degrading Hezbollah, right, destroying the arsenal of missiles and drones and weapons, but is physically pushing back the contingent of Hezbollah fighters that are near the Israeli border or in southern Lebanon more broadly, let's say. And that's a question, right? What would be acceptable to Israel? Would that be a few kilometers, 7, 10? Is it further back to this point that's often mentioned, the Litani River? And that remains to be seen. But irrespective, the idea is to push them back. And that likely means over some course of time, Israeli ground incursion or operation as well in order to secure that area and guarantee this type of a official goal.
How close are we to an Israeli ground invasion of Lebanon? Because just today, the Wall Street Journal is reporting that Israeli special forces have conducted small-scale raids into southern Lebanon. So can we expect Israel to full-out ground invade their northern neighbor?
I think that it looks increasingly likely that we could see this, right, within days, potentially weeks. One, you have very strong, hawkish rhetoric from the Israeli military, but also political leadership that has been present, but I think really has been intensifying over the past few weeks. There have been military exercises ongoing since October, but again, more of those taking place. Military mobilization of reservists as well in Israel. This is very important for the ability of Israel to be able to conduct any kind of more expansive ground incursion or operation, given that there's an ongoing offensive in Gaza. There are military operations in the West Bank, right? So this requires some form of reservist mobilization. And then just most recently now, there's also been a decision to declare some of these areas near Israel's northern border with Lebanon as special military zones. And to me, all of this suggests that there is an intention to launch some type of military incursion or operation. Again, the scope will really be something of a question, as well as how deep into Lebanon those forces go. But the reporting that you point to about the raids of Israeli military units, or potentially a smaller number of Israeli forces, I think is the initial stage of preparing for that, in addition to this very expansive and intensive bombardment of southern Lebanon that has taken place now over at least a few weeks, basically.
After the strikes over the past couple of days that took out Hezbollah top leadership, I've seen the characterization that Israel decapitates Hezbollah. So does Hezbollah even have the capacity to retaliate at this point?
Right. Well, one, I think that decision has probably not been fully taken on the Hezbollah side in terms of how to approach the situation. It has happened so quickly, and I think that this has also taken Hezbollah by surprise, that this many of its senior commanders and members of the military chain of command have also been killed. So it might very well be that that decision has not been taken. It requires potentially filling some of those roles, looking at who comes into the group, and then deciding how to approach this. Then there's a question of, is it because the decision has been taken or because there are real operational challenges and gaps, right? Which is entirely possible as well. That because of Israel's continued offensive and, the killing of different members, but also the targeting of weapons and different kinds of assets, it may be difficult for Hezbollah to launch a very significant response or retaliation against Israel. And then the pager and device attacks that you mentioned are also significant. I mean, yes, Hezbollah has different means of communication. There's also a land network, but presumably some of the ability to communicate has also been compromised as a result of these attacks. So I would put it to a combination of potential indecision yet as to how to fully respond to this, and the fact that there are real operational and logistical challenges that the group is having to face. I suspect that although Israel has gone after, again, these missiles, and especially the long-range ones, and different kinds of weapons depots, there's still a robust stockpile of weapons that Hezbollah could use, but we have to see whether that materializes in terms of a significant or very coordinated response. It has not yet.
I think another key component of this conversation is Iran. As we know, Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran. We also know that Hamas is a proxy of Iran. Israel has been fighting both fronts for almost a year now. So where does Iran go from here?
Right. The question of Iran's response function, again, what kind of decisions the leadership makes, I think is very important, not just when we think about the Israel-Lebanon or Israel-Hezbollah front, but more widely regional escalation risks, right? Hamas, Hezbollah, other groups in the region that are broadly aligned with this axis of resistance grouping have their own drivers as well, right? Domestic drivers of sorts, local drivers and interests. And then there are some ideological components and alignment on different interests and issues, right? So I wouldn't say that there's a strict kind of command control or instructions from Tehran. Like, all of these groups operate with their own local context and drivers and interests. But the question of Iran is important. For now, it seems that Iran, and really if we go back and think about this over the past few months and the escalation that we've seen in the region since October, that Iran has for the most part been reluctant to become directly engaged in a conflict. Again, there are these various groups that are aligned with it that can be leveraged and are able to be disruptive. The Houthis in Yemen should also be mentioned in that bucket, and they've been extremely disruptive when it comes to international trade through the Red Sea. So I think that's one, right, that Iran has that tool of sorts at its disposal. But the other is that there are real risks that come with really becoming directly engaged and involved, and it may be that that's too high a threshold right now, and that Iran is not really interested in doing that. Now, the challenge that Hezbollah faces is, of course, very important for Iran, right? Because Hezbollah has really been seen as this kind of core deterrent component for Iran, right? And so that's a challenge if Israel continues to further degrade Hezbollah, and as a result, that deterrent capacity, including deterring Israel from potentially going after Iran because Hezbollah is nearby, is eroded, and that's probably something that the Iranian leadership will have to consider. But so far, what we've heard, including last week at the UN General Assembly from the Iranian president, was that they are not interested in becoming directly engaged. And there has also been an effort by the Iranian leadership to try to explore potentially engaging more with Western powers, and broadly, I would say a more pragmatic approach, including to establishing relations with the Gulf states. So probably a lot of risks that would come with bigger escalation.
In conversations I've had since October 7th, there's been this fear of escalation in the Middle East. This conflict is ratcheting up, obviously, between Hezbollah and Israel. We've seen Israel and Hamas in a war in Gaza for almost a year now. Do you think we are going to see a full-blown regional war? And if so, how soon?
I would say that in a way it's very remarkable, because the events that we've seen since October to now are in some ways unprecedented, right? There have been these very big juncture points that the region has faced, and yet has come out on the other end of that without going to the point of a region-wide escalation. I mean, yes, there is escalation on all kinds of fronts in the region, and very intensive strikes and violence that has been taking place since October, but we have not seen this move to a region-wide war, and I still think that that is unlikely. There are several reasons for that. One is the fact that the key actors in the region, aside from Israel's, continued escalation and increasingly emboldened positioning and stance, but Iran, for one, and as well as other regional powers, right, Gulf states, but also China, the EU. None of those actors are interested in bigger escalation or something that would really drag the whole region into a confrontation. So I think that serves as a sort of constraint. And again, if you look back over the last year, there are these remarkable juncture points where it felt like the region was really at a precipice. But in the end, that escalation did not amount to what was potentially warned of, or where the concern level was, and I think that that's likely to persist. So there are these bounds of sort, but there are tail risks, right, of course, to consider, and that includes potentially Iran or the US becoming more directly engaged in a confrontation, or Israel taking action against Iran. So those are the watch points, I would say, to consider over the next few months.
To your point, it does feel like we're at one of those juncture points right now. So specifically, what are the moves you're looking out for next as the expert in the region?
Sure. So I'm always, keeping an eye on the different regional fronts. So Gaza, of course, and the West Bank, I do still think that as much as attention has shifted towards the Israel-Hezbollah conflict at the moment, Gaza still matters because it is very important for other groups in the region, for militia actors as well in the region. So I keep an eye on that. Of course, we're looking to see what the scope of escalation ends up being when it comes to Israel's offensive in Lebanon. I expect the aerial campaign will remain very intensive. Likely there will be some kind of a ground component, potentially smaller scale, narrower first, right, incremental, and then becomes more expansive. So that's something to look out for, as well as whether this either incentivizes or it forces in some ways other allies of Hezbollah, not just Iran, but Iran included, to become more directly engaged in some manner. And then looking at the other fronts, I mean, there has been more activity in Syria as well. There's a lot of volatility in Iraq, right? We're doing a tour of the region now, but then thinking also about the Houthi capabilities and what might come out of Yemen. So really, it's looking at all of these different dynamics in terms of the regional fronts, and then central to all of this is, as an analyst, I'm also looking very closely at Israeli domestic politics as a driver, as a trigger of potential escalation or de-escalation, right? So what are the pressures domestically in terms of, again, the bottom-up societal pressure? where is the center of gravity within the government, within the political parties, and what is the Israeli military leadership saying? Has the willingness to take more risks or the tolerance for risks in the region increased or not? And then I also look very closely at the rhetoric, but really at the signals that the U.S. is sending as Israel's closest ally and partner, right? I mean, the U.S. has shown itself to be either, unwilling or relatively ineffective in constraining Israel on different fronts. So, I mean, it still can wield a lot of influence on developments in the region. So that's an important factor to consider.
Do you think the United States' response to Israel is going to change in light of the events of the past weekend?
I'm skeptical about that, given what we have seen over the past year, and even looking at the U.S. response over the past few days, really, right? I think again the U.S. has either been unwilling or in the instances when it has tried, it has proved to be ineffective in really wielding more influence on the Israeli leadership. And given that track record over the past year, I'm skeptical that the picture would be very different. In Lebanon, to me, what we're seeing in terms of statements from the US side and also in a way mirrored from the Israeli side about a potential ground operation reminds me of the kind of rhetoric that we saw around Rafah operation, where there was talk around it and then potentially of something more narrow and limited, and it seems very similar to me.
Well, Sophia, as the situation develops in the Middle East, I hope you come back on, provide your expertise and your insight for myself as well as our viewers. Thank you so much for joining me.